Gill in Third Strike is not a character that anyone should be subjecting innocent people to under any normal circumstances, and while he's not a character that most people would, or admittedly should, be familiar with, I think most people know enough to know why that's a good thing.
Alright, that's cool.
However, while Gill is an intentionally overpowered non-playable boss character, he's still a character, one with very little information or documentation out there on the specifics of why he's as well and truly fucked up as he is in this game. So I figured it'd be fun to take a bit of a deep dive into Gill's kit and examine the parts of it that make him the way he is in this game. And the parts of his kit that have basically nothing to do with him being the way he is in this game. He's got some garbage too. Now, first things first, I do want to clarify that I'm going to be specifically talking about the version of Gill present in the arcade version of Third Strike, the one you'd find on Fightcade or 30th Anniversary Edition. That might seem obvious, but weirdly enough, Gill is the only character in the game where I'd say the version of him that most people are familiar with is not the version of him present in the arcade version, but the one present in the console ports of Third Strike. In the Dreamcast and PS2 ports of Third Strike and Street Fighter III Online Edition, Gill is actually an unlockable character. The reason I'm bringing all of this up is because, believe it or not, Gill was actually very slightly buffed in the console ports. His fireball became super cancelable, which is not possible in the arcade version. In the arcade version of the game, the only way you could play as Gill is by transforming into him in arcade mode with 12's X-Copy. And in X-Copy, you don't have access to a character's supers, so you'd never know. This doesn't really make the console version of Gill better than the arcade version, just a bit more potentially flashy. Notably, this gives him a juggle into Seraphic Wing, which is basically impossible to combo into in the arcade version. This does significantly less damage than his meterless options, but it sure does look cool. You could also hypothetically cancel Fireball into Meteor Strike to make the world's scariest anti-air. Realistically, this cancel is just combo video fodder, but I mean, that's kind of what Gill is, so it's all good. Also, in case you're wondering why my console footage of Third Strike looks so fucked up and blurry, I could sit here and lie to you and say it's that I don't understand PS2 emulation, but the honest to god truth is that I'm just paying homage to all those old Gill combo videos, the ones that got uploaded to YouTube like 15 years ago in 240p. I'm just being respectful, that's all. Promise. Anyways, with all that out the way, we can now get onto Gill's traits as a character in the arcade version of the game. First things first, maybe somewhat surprisingly, Gill does not have the highest health in the game. His health is very slightly higher than Urian's, which feels very intentional, but that still leaves him at second overall behind Hugo. However, he is tied for the highest stun in the game, alongside Hugo, Alex, Q, Dudley, and Oro. In terms of frame data, Gill's dashes are the exact same as Urian's, a 15 frame forward dash and a 19 frame back dash. The only thing that's changed is how far they travel. Gill's go much further. Gill's throws are functionally identical to Urian's, just stronger. They have the same stun up, recovery, and give the exact same amount of advantage on knockdown. The only difference is increased damage and stun. Neutral throw doesn't do that much more stun than Urian's, but it does over double the damage. Although it is a mash throw, so the opponent can mash to escape it. Forward and back throw do around 50% more damage than Urian's and inflict over double the stun. Believe it or not, Gill's forward and back throw actually do the same damage as Alex's heavy power bomb. They're by a long shot the most powerful throws in the game. Gill's universal overhead is practically the same as Urian's. It's got the exact same hitbox, identical frame data. The only real differences are that it does very slightly more stun, and that it's generally easier to link out of thanks to faster startup on the rest of his kit. Gill's taunt is the first part of his kit that I would call outright bad. If he can pull it off, he gets a massive damage boost on his next hit or combo. However, safely getting this taunt off is practically impossible, because at 136 frames, Gill's taunt has the longest minimum duration of any taunt in the game, taking 5 frames longer than Remy's notoriously awful taunt. Also, unlike someone such as Q for example, Gill needs to complete the entire taunt to get the damage boost. If he's hit out of it, even near the end, he won't get the damage boost. It's so slow that you're not even guaranteed to get it after a stun, and even if you were, it would be kind of redundant, because if you're Gill and you've stunned the opponent, you've probably already won, damage boost or no damage boost. When it comes to Gill's hurtbox, things are nearly identical to Urien, but not quite 1-to-1. Gill's standing hurtbox, both for idling and for getting hit, is extremely similar to Urien's. Unlike Urien, however, Gill doesn't move during his crouching idle, and as a result, his hurtbox doesn't move either. When it comes to juggles, it's a bit of a mixed bag. If it works on Urien, it's almost definitely gonna work on Gill. However, it doesn't go both ways, because there's plenty of juggles that work on Gill that don't work on Urien, or any normal character for that matter. Gill just has a little bit of extra jank under the hood. Second Impact, on the other hand, is a completely different story. Gill's hurtbox is well and truly fucked in this game, and not counting Kyuko getting hit OTG by certain supers after a throw, he's the only character in the game that you can hit with restands in a combo. Both of the examples I'm showing here were provided by Heather, which I greatly appreciate because she's a lot more familiar with 2i than I am, and there's no way I could execute any of this. She has an entire combo video dedicated to Gill restands that I would definitely recommend checking out because it's very cool. I'll make sure to link it in the description, it's absolutely worth a watch. Nearly all of this was fixed in Third Strike, although there's still a tiny bit of funny stuff left over, including a completely useless but very quirked up infinite. However, speaking of character-specific combos, Gill has plenty of them, but he actually goes a little bit further than that, because he's, I believe, the only character in the entire game to not only have character-specific combos, but to have side-specific combos. Depending on if Gill is on the player 1 or the player 2 side, his fireball, tackle, and heavy normals will inflict either an ice or a fire effect. The only thing that changes about these moves depending on the side of the screen that you're on is the effect that they apply on hit. Other than that, they're fundamentally identical with the same hitboxes, damage output, and frame data. The side-specific element of Gill's combo game comes into play when you launch the opponent with one of these attacks. If you launch the opponent with an attack that applies a fire effect, everything is pretty much as you'd expect. However, launch the opponent with an attack that applies an ice effect and you'll start to see the issue. The opponent is put into a unique frozen state, and in this state, their hurtbox is in a completely different position to what you'd expect when launching the opponent. Just to give an example of this in practice, a point-blank crouching heavy kick into standing medium kick is a near-universal combo for Gill. But against Alex and Elena, it only works on the player 1 side. And against Oro, Ibuki, Yun, and Yang, it only works on the player 2 side. There is actually one more tool in Gill's kit that changes depending on the side of the screen that you're on, but we'll be touching on that in a minute because there's a little bit more to it than just the effect that it applies on hit. Moving on to Gill's supers, not only are they pretty unorthodox on their own, But unlike every other character in the game, Gill doesn't choose a super before the game starts. He just has access to all three of them, two of which he can do at any point with full meter, and one of which is triggered under specific circumstances if he has full meter.
Welcome to your death. Let's go. Let me be the vessel of all. Kneel.
This sounds incredible, and believe me, for other characters it could be. But weirdly enough, this is at best not that big of a deal for Gill, and at worst, potentially actively detrimental, although that'll make more sense once we get into his supers individually. First things first, we have Meteor Strike, which is a pretty great but still pretty unorthodox super. It's useless in traditional confirms or punishes because while it does have 1 frame startup, the meteors have travel time, so it's not actually that fast in practice.
Welcome to your death.
It's very easy to juggle into, but doing so just isn't quite as rewarding as you'd hope. If Gill gets the opportunity to go for a juggle combo, then he wants the opponent stunned by the end of it, and doing so meterlessly isn't exactly that hard for him a lot of the time. There's just not a ton of situations where a meterless juggle combo wouldn't kill, but a juggle into Meteor Strike would.
Welcome to your death. Let's go.
Even in these situations, Meteor Strike is just not the most consistent thing in the world. The amount of meteors that actually connect with the opponent can vary a lot based on the side of the screen you're on, the character you're fighting, how high up they are when you're juggling them, or if you're a bit early or late on the super input.
Welcome to your death. Let's go.
One aspect of Meteor Strike that's fun to mess around with, but would hypothetically be a little bit irritating if you could actually play this character against real people, is that not only can you juggle into it, but you can actually juggle out of it too, since all of the meteors reset the juggle counter on hit.
Welcome to your death. Let's go.
However, you might have noticed the issue here, and that's that, going off the numbers here, Urian totally should be stunned by now, and he's kind of not. The issue here is that not only is your damage and stun output just a little bit lower thanks to scaling, but that the opponent's stun is actually going down during Meteor Strike and the combo after, just because the combo took so damn long. It's essentially fighting off the stun as much as it can. It's kind of funny, but, you know, would be hypothetically annoying, I guess. And one more potentially irritating quirked up thing about Meteor Strike. It's the last and arguably most drastic instance of side-specific stuff in Gill's kit. If you're on the player 1 side, the first meteor to come down is an icy one that's relatively close to Gill.
Welcome to your death.
If you're on the player 2 side, the first meteor to land is a fiery one that hits it around full screen.
Welcome to your death.
This might seem really irritating, but to be fair, it does enable something really good for Gill. Now, it might feel like I haven't had that many nice things to say about Meteor Strike so far, and you would be kind of right. However, there are 2 uses for the move that I think would be potentially excellent, and we're going to get into them now. The first of which being its use in air resets.
Welcome to your death.
By doing an air reset into Meteor Strike, you put the opponent in a really nasty position where they have to try and parry their way out, or eat an unscaled Meteor Strike that will do significant damage and a ton of stun. The parry timing is really awkward since the meteors do not hit with a consistent rhythm at all, and overall this is just great for Gill. It allows him to squeeze out damage in situations where he otherwise isn't going to get any at all, or squeeze out a stun in situations where it would otherwise be very difficult or impossible.
Welcome to your death.
I figured I should show you what parrying it looks like, but the dummy in Fightcade training mode genuinely couldn't figure it out, so the PS2 version is coming in clutch again. It is worth noting that Gill cannot move during the move's animation, so it's not like he and the meteors can try and hit you at the same time to mess with your parry timing. As for the other great use of Meteor Strike, it gives Gill access to a very strange but nonetheless incredibly powerful confirm. If Gill is on the player 2 side, he can combo a Meteor Strike after a spaced crouching heavy kick, and it works on the entire cast. This is completely universal, incredibly easy, does 60 to 75% depending on the character, and is done off a very fast, relatively safe move. Gill's sweep has 7 frames of startup, and is only -6 on block with quite a bit of pushback. As incredible as this confirm is, it is strictly a player 2 side only ordeal. On the player 1 side, crouching heavy kick into Meteor Strike only works on Hugo, and the sweep has to hit point blank. Nonetheless, this confirm is ludicrous. This is bar none Gill's best use of meter in my opinion. Seraphic Wing is another very unorthodox super, and I'd say this one is a bit more situational, but still potentially very good. In terms of raw damage output, it is the strongest super in the game, and the stun output is very good as well.
Let me be lesser of all.
However, it's also the slowest super in the game, with a whopping 48 frames of startup, although interestingly, it has 0 frame startup after the super freeze, so if you're not already blocking it before the super freeze, you're going to get hit.
Let me be lesser of all.
Gill isn't invincible during the move's startup, so if he attempts to go for this in neutral, the entire cast can just hit him out of it on reaction. However, interestingly enough, if you do hit him out of the startup, he doesn't actually lose any meter for attempting it. His meter doesn't go down until after the super freeze, which is kind of strange. Hitting Gill out of the move's startup is important because this isn't really a super you can avoid. It hits full screen and the chip damage on block is ludicrous.
Let me be lesser of all souls.
Akuma can avoid most of it with teleport, but not the entire thing. Best case scenario, he avoids 15 out of the 20 hits.
Let me be lesser of all.
At the very least, this could save you from, like, meaty Seraphic Wing, and funnily enough, getting hit by the last 5 hits does less damage than blocking all 20, so there is that. However, while Seraphic Wing's chip damage is incredible, Gill really needs to ensure that he kills you with it, because the super is -58 on block. Either it kills you on block, or Gill is eating a significant punish.
Let me be lesser of all souls.
The combination of having very long startup, being very easy to interrupt, and being massively unsafe on block mean that Seraphic Wing is pretty much exclusively good for chipping out a low health opponent after a knockdown. And even then, you can't just do it off any knockdown. It needs to be one that gives enough frame advantage, like a sweep. However, there's one more quirk of Seraphic Wing that we need to touch on, and unfortunately this is the one aspect of Gill that I'm just well and truly stumped on. The first hit of Seraphic Wing, without a shadow of a doubt, is unparryable.
Let me be lesser of all.
This has been relatively common knowledge for a long ass time. This much is, like, concrete, no one's arguing this. It's the other 19 hits where I'm just a little lost. I was always under the impression it was like Akuma's KKZ, where you had to block the first hit, and then you could parry your way out. However, I have sunk an embarrassing amount of time into trying to get a single parry out of Seraphic Wing, and I've had absolutely no luck, and I'm starting to think it's not just me.
Let me be lesser of all.
According to this thing, I hit the parry timing, but I sure as hell didn't get no damn parry. Obviously, I could just be fumbling the execution over and over, but even if you set a training dummy to parry everything on either the Fightcade or the console version, then they'll also fail to parry any of it, even if you whiff the first supposedly only unparryable hit while they're knocked down. Now, as tempting as it would be to say that all 20 hits of Seraphic Wing are unparryable based on this, I'm not quite convinced, because I did find one piece of evidence to suggest otherwise. There's footage of exactly one person parrying Seraphic Wing in any capacity, and it's this here, where they block the first hit, and then alternate between parries and blocks to essentially half the chip damage it does. This was on the PS2 version, but still, it's more than enough to cast doubt in my mind. If anyone else has concrete evidence on the parry ability of Seraphic Wing, I'd love to see it, but until then, the first hit is definitely unparryable, and take the other 19 with a grain of salt. Resurrection is maybe the game's most unique super, but it's also the reason that I'm not entirely convinced that Gill having access to all 3 of his supers rather than just picking the one he wants is necessarily a good thing. It's the only super in the game that you don't traditionally input. Instead, it just triggers automatically if Gill dies with full meter.
Resurrection.
Once Resurrection has been triggered, Gill's meter is effectively broken, and he can no longer gain any more for not just the round, but the entire game. The big issue with Resurrection is that it is laughably easy to stop. Gill does have a little bit of invincibility when it starts up, so he is guaranteed to get a little bit of health back, but then you can literally just hit him, leaving him with very little health and a broken super meter. The opponent does get pushed back during Resurrection, so they might have a bit of trouble getting as easy or optimal of a combo as they'd like on Gill, but even then, it's entirely possible to just kill him during Resurrection, completely defeating the point of the move. Granted, most characters need super if they want to kill Gill off Resurrection, but the fact they can do it at all is kind of awesome. Even if you picked the wrong super, don't have enough meter, or didn't get an ideal knockdown, the fact that it's so easy to just hit Gill out of Resurrection and leave him with a minimal amount of health and a busted super meter is a little pathetic. In a weird way, Resurrection might be a contender for the worst super in Third Strike, because yes, there are plenty of other bad supers in this game, but at least with them you can, like, not pick them.
Well, I got the picture.
And even hypothetically, if you, like, passed out at the character select screen and then woke up in a match with a shitty super, you could just not use the super and spend your meter on EX and things. Gill, on the other hand, can't really manage his meter. He has no EX moves, randomly throwing out Seraphic Wing is death, and while Meteor Strike can be safe, depending on the side of the screen you're on and how far you are from the opponent,
Welcome to your death.
I don't know, throwing away all your meter to play around not getting Resurrection is pretty silly. Realistically, whether or not you die with full meter is just a bit out of your hands. That being said, it did just occur to me that if you're playing as Gill, you probably shouldn't be losing. So, I don't know, I guess if you're playing the mirror, hypothetically, it would be annoying. Moving on to Gill's specials, there are a few tiny little things to touch on before talking about them individually. First of all, like I mentioned earlier, Gill has no EX moves.
Pyrokinesis.
On top of that though, Fireball is the only one of his 4 specials to have different variations depending on the button strength you use to input it. Headbutt, Tackle, and Knee Drop will always be functionally identical regardless of whether you input them with light, medium, or heavy. Unlike Urien, Gill is not a charge character in any capacity. His Fireball is still done with quarter circle forward and punch,
Pyrokinesis.
but Headbutt is now done with quarter circle back and punch, Knee Drop is half circle back and kick, and Tackle is DP and punch. I'm going to talk about Gill's 4 special moves in the order that I think are from worst to best. So that means first up, we've got Knee Drop. Knee Drop is probably one of the worst special moves in the game. It is really, really rough. Knee Drop hits twice, tracks the opponent, and hits overhead. which might sound kinda good, but bear with me, okay? The move has a whopping 40 frames of startup, so it is incredibly easy to parry on reaction, although Gill does recover in the air, so you'll have to adjust your punish accordingly. It's entirely possible to get a grounded punish, just a little bit more awkward. Also, you might have noticed that knee drop can cross the opponent up, but it doesn't really matter in practice. Like I said, knee drop tracks the opponent. It just goes to wherever the opponent was when Gill input the move, so it's not really something Gill can play around, it's just a thing that happens sometimes. And because you'll press forward if you attempt to parry the knee drop, an attempt to parry a non-cross-up knee drop will end up blocking a cross-up one. However, I've been talking about all this like you have to parry knee drop, and you definitely don't, but we'll touch on that in a second. If knee drop hits a crouching opponent, it will only hit once, and it will leave Gill plus 12 on hit. This is actually pretty good. You are pretty far away from the opponent, but it gives you a link to stand heavy punch for damage, or crouching heavy kick for a knockdown. However, this move isn't exactly the most consistent thing in the world across the whole cast. Against Oro, Necro, and Ibuki, it will only hit once even if they're standing. But against Ibuki and only Ibuki, you'll be plus 10 instead of plus 12. You'll also be plus 10 instead of plus 12 against the crouching Alex. But he gets hit by both hits while standing, unlike Ibuki. Hugo gets hit by both hits whether he's standing or crouching, leaving Gill incredibly minus. And like Hugo, Dudley gets hit by both hits while crouching, but unlike Hugo, Gill will still be plus. It's really funny how a move you shouldn't use on a character you can't use has this many weird little inconsistencies going on with it, but honestly, I kinda love it. I find shit like this really charming, I'm all for it. You probably noticed this when I did the move against Hugo, but with the exception of the weird crouching Dudley thing, if Gill connects both hits of knee drop, he's not only minus on block, but minus on hit as well. Best case scenario, he'll be minus 16 or 17 depending on the character. So yeah, you've probably pieced together why this move kinda sucks ass. Gill's headbutt unfortunately doesn't seem all that great. It being a motion special rather than a charge one is nice, Urien would fucking kill for that, but unfortunately it just really doesn't seem to serve that much of a purpose in the context of Gill's kit. The frame data is nearly the same as Urien's medium headbutt. The startup and active frames are the same, but the recovery is 1 frame shorter. Gill's headbutt does the same damage as Urien's heavy headbutt, and it does slightly less stun than Urien's EX headbutt. However, unlike all of Urien's headbutts, Gill's headbutt does not knock down on a grounded connect, and that fucking sucks, especially since you're minus on hit. Best case scenario, you can space it to be 0 on hit, but that's incredibly difficult to do, so it's just not really worth going for. Gill is considered airborne during the attack, so it will beat throws. Unfortunately, trying to use headbutt like this is a bit hit or miss, because Gill's headbutt not only whiffs against every crouching character, but quite a lot of standing characters too. And as a result, it'll also whiff against their throw attempts. Although you could definitely catch them off guard and go for a throw of your own after. Granted, this can happen with Urien's headbutts too, even the light one. But overall, it's way more consistent than Gill's. Urien's light and medium headbutt are fantastic moves. However, while Gill's headbutt doesn't seem to have much going for it on the ground, you'd think it'd be a lot better in the air, because it's very easy to juggle into and out of. Urien can juggle out of a meatless headbutt too, it's just a lot more fiddly and character specific. Still very cool though, I'm a big fan of this. However, while Gill's headbutt is very easy to juggle into and juggle out of, I'm pretty sure it's useless in juggles too, and that's for one big reason. Gill's headbutt increments the juggle counter by 3, which means after just 2 raw headbutts, the juggle counter is already at 6, and continuing the combo is practically impossible. If you're not familiar with Third Strike's juggle system, I talked about it in my Orbs and Fighting Games video, and I think I got it like 75 to 80% right, maybe, potentially. Basically, there's this invisible value that we'll call the juggle counter. Every move in the game increments it by a set amount when used in a juggle combo, and the higher that value is, the smaller the window to continue the combo becomes. Once you've hit 6, your combo is usually over, with the exception of things like ending the combo in a multi-hit move like Akuma SA1 and still getting all the hits because they're very, very close together. In the first combo, the juggle counter was at 4 when I cancelled into Fireball, and it comboed no problem. But in the second one, the juggle counter was at 6 when I cancelled into Fireball, and by that point, the gap between the first hit of Crouching Heavy Punch and the Fireball connecting was just too big, and the combo dropped. However, if I don't cancel that 4th Crouching Heavy Punch, then the second hit of it still connects, even though the juggle counter is at 6, because the 2 hits are just very, very close together. Headbutt incrementing the juggle counter by 3 is so bad because it just leaves the move outdone by Gill's other options. Tackle only increments it by 1 or 2 depending on the number of hits, and Standing Heavy Punch only increments it by 1. Ending your juggles in Headbutt doesn't really seem worth your time either. If Gill gets the opportunity to go for a juggle combo, the second to last hit is usually always going to be a Standing Heavy Punch or a tackle where he only gets the second hit. For the former, ending in Headbutt is extremely difficult or impossible. And for the latter, you can just end the combo in a 2-hit tackle, which does significantly more damage and stun than a Headbutt. Overall, it might feel like I've had basically nothing nice to say about Headbutt, but I do genuinely think it's better than Knee Drop. Headbutt is usable, just outclassed. Knee Drop is genuinely dogshit. I can't think of a single situation where you'd want to use it. Gill's Fireball seems pretty good. Like I mentioned earlier, this is the only one of Gill's specials to have 3 different variations depending on the button strength you use to input it. Medium sends up at a slight angle, and Heavy sends up at a 45-degree angle. It's basically the same deal as Urien's Fireball, and they've got the same startup too, at 13 frames. Gill's Fireball does have plenty of differences from Urien's though. For a start, all 3 versions have the same amount of recovery, which is not the case for Urien. Urien's Light, Medium, and Heavy Fireball have a total duration of 53, 49, and 42 frames respectively. For Gill, all 3 versions have 51 total frames. Secondly, Gill's Fireballs travel noticeably faster than Urien's. Arguably the biggest difference from Urien's Fireball is that Gill's is 2 hits. For a meterless Fireball, this is pretty great. It means it's still decent on block despite being relatively fast with pretty high recovery, it makes it slightly more difficult to parry, and probably most importantly, it gives Gill more time to act while the opponent is parrying it. One small downside of Gill's Fireball being 2 hits is that it does increment the juggle counter by 2 rather than 1 like Urien's. This technically hurts your combo potential off anti-air Fireball, but it's not that big of a deal. If Gill's Fireball incremented the juggle counter by 1 instead of 2, that tackle would have connected after the stand heavy punch, but I don't know, it's not that big of a loss. You can use Fireballs mid-combo, but I assure you there's no point. They do nowhere near enough damage or stun to warrant increasing the juggle counter by 2. Like I mentioned earlier, Gill's Fireball will apply a different effect on hit depending on the side of the screen he's on when he uses it. This technically means that you have side-specific juggles with it, but since there's no incentive to use it in juggles anyway, it doesn't really matter. And one last thing on Fireball, unlike Urien, Gill can't delay his Fireball. It's a bad day to be a Gill player, let me tell you. I don't know how he's going to recover from this one. Gill's Tackle is without a doubt his most important special move, which you probably would have guessed from the numerous combos I've been doing where the opponent gets fucking deleted by it. However, while it's incredible in juggles, it's actually pretty strange on the ground. Lariat starts up in only 4 frames, so you'd assume it'd be amazing for punishing things on the ground, but weirdly enough, it's not as good as you'd think. Rather than just having a hitbox on Gill's body, as you'd probably expect from a move like this, Gill lurches forward a significant distance going from the 3rd to the 4th frame of this move, and an annoyingly small and high up hitbox appears on his hand. Thanks to this bizarre hitbox, the first hit of Gill's Lariat whiffs on the entire crouching cast with the exception of Hugo. The second hit isn't that much better off either. It only hits 7 of the game's 20 characters if they're crouching, including Gill, those being Akuma, Dudley, Hugo, Q, Remy, Urien, and Gill. Even against those 7 characters, I don't think throwing out tackle from a distance is that good of an idea. For a start, the damage is pretty underwhelming, even by not Gill standards. And secondly, I just think throwing out the move is pretty unsafe. It's only a single parry, and while it's only -5 on block, it has very little pushback, and Gill continues to move forward after it connects with the opponent. It is possible to get both hits of tackle to connect on a standing opponent, and this is the best case scenario, because it will launch the opponent and you will be massively rewarded. However, emphasis on possible, because unfortunately this is not very universal at all. Against the vast majority of the standing cast, only the first hit of tackle connects. This just knocks the opponent down, but at the very least it does do decent damage, so if this is all you can get as a punish, I don't know, it could be worse. Getting both hits of tackle to connect on a grounded opponent only works against a standing Necro, Makoto, Ibuki, Chun, or Alex, and for whatever reason, it's bizarrely inconsistent on Alex. I don't know why Alex is such a magnet for bizarre hurtbox shenanigans. I would just love to know what's up with him. At the end of the day though, Gill's tackle being so inconsistent against grounded opponents isn't the biggest deal in the world because that's just not where the move shines. Like I said before, it's at its best in juggle combos, and while I'll be breaking down the intricacies of Gill's juggle combos near the end of the video, for now I'd like to look at the 3 different ways that tackle can connect in a juggle combo. First of all, when you get both hits. While the 2-hit tackle does increment the juggle counter by 2, the absolutely obscene damage is hard to pass up. For Gill's optimal mid-screen routes off a crouching heavy punch, a 2-hit tackle will always be the first thing you juggle into, before transitioning into 1-hit tackles to bring the opponent into the corner. If you land a crouching heavy punch in the corner but you want to route for damage rather than stun, then 3 2-hit tackles is the way to go. This is almost always what you're going to be going for after stunning the opponent. Tackles where you only get the second hit are integral to Gill's combo game because while they don't do anywhere near as much damage as a tackle that hits twice, they do about 75% of the stun while only incrementing the juggle counter by 1. As a result, they're integral to Gill's touch of stun and, as a result, death combos. Tackles where you only get the first hit will knock the opponent down and end your juggle. This is the absolute worst case scenario, you basically never want this to happen, but unfortunately it's probably going to happen sooner or later, because while in terms of structure, Gill's optimal juggles are actually fairly close to universal, they are not universal in terms of difficulty. You're going to get accidental first hit tackles here and there against characters like Urien, 12, and especially Dudley, who, at least from my experience, is by a long shot the hardest character in the game to do optimal Gill routes on. And lastly, just like Fireball, Gill's tackle applies a different effect on hit depending on the side of the screen he's on when he uses it. Surprisingly enough, this actually doesn't affect his optimal routes all that much. They don't vary very much at all depending on the side you're on, although there's one small exception that I'll touch on later. Finally, we can talk about Gill's normals, and as I'm sure you've noticed, a lot of them are pretty familiar. Every single one of Gill's basic jumping, standing, and crouching normals is taken from Urien, with various adjustments to their properties, frame data, and hitboxes. I'll save us a bit of time right now and let you know that every single one of Gill's normals, with the sole exception of Crouching Light Punch and Crouching Light Kick, deals more damage and stun than it does on Urien. Crouching Light Punch and Crouching Light Kick do more stun, but the same damage. However, while most of Gill's normals were taken from Urien, he didn't take everything. Gill has no equivalent to Urien's forward medium punch, or his forward heavy punch. Gill also has no target combos, while Urien has two. His stand light punch, stand medium punch one, and his forward medium punch, forward heavy punch one. I've seen some confusion regarding this, with people not only thinking Gill has the stand light punch, stand medium punch target combo, but a crouching light kick, crouching medium kick one, similar to what he has in Street Fighter V. While it's true he can combo the former into the latter, they're not target combos, just links. None of Gill's lights are cancelable in any way, shape or form. Not into the second hit of a target combo, not into specials, not into supers. Nothing. Speaking of cancels, this is one area where Urien's normals are actually better off than Gill's, because Gill only has two cancelable normals, and I don't think either cancel really does anything for him. He can cancel the first hit of Crouching Heavy Punch, and he can cancel his back medium punch, which is a normal unique to Gill. The Crouching Heavy Punch cancel I'm almost certain is useless. You can cancel into Fireball to be safer on block, I guess. But Crouching Heavy Punch isn't even that unsafe to begin with. And by cancelling the move into Fireball, you're giving up the opportunity to get a juggle combo, which is like the single most rewarding thing in the game. Unlike Urien, the first hit of Gill's Crouching Heavy Punch does maintain a juggle state, so you can use the cancel and juggle combos. There's just not really any incentive to do so, because you're incrementing the juggle counter by 1 to add relatively little damage and stun compared to his other options. Back medium punch is Gill's strongest cancel, so technically against the 5 characters who get hit by both hits of tackle while standing, you can get some really powerful stuff off it. It's just pretty redundant. You can't safely confirm it without a jump in or a parry, and Crouching Heavy Punch is just so much more reliable. You can kinda tell from looking at it that back medium punch was intended to be an anti-air. And you'd think cancelling this would be great for Gill. He'd be able to catch people who are only going for one air parry by cancelling into either headbutt or fireball, similar to what Urien does with stand medium punch. Unfortunately, Gill was not so lucky. Only the early active frames that hit much closer to the ground are cancelable, so 9 times out of 10, this is just a single air parry. If you know it's gonna stun, you could maybe end a juggle in a cancel to taunt just to give you more time to get it off before the opponent recovers from stun. But this is just wholly unnecessary. Gill does not need the damage boost from taunt to just delete people in the corner. Also, on top of being special cancelable, both of these buttons are super cancelable. I'm almost certain this does nothing for Gill, but it's a thing he can do, so I will not be able to sleep at night if I don't mention it. Moving on to Gill's light normals, Crouching Light Punch and Standing Light Kick are unremarkably good. They're better than Urien's in terms of frame data, but there's not a lot to say. Their hitboxes are the exact same, although interestingly, Standing Light Kick has had its extended hurtbox on the foot removed, which is interesting, I think. Standing Light Punch and Crouching Light Kick are a lot more notable. First of all, Standing Light Punch is 2 frames, so it's tied for the fastest normal in the game. They're +5 and +4 on hit and block respectively, so you can link them into Standing Medium Punch and Crouching Medium Kick. Thanks to his lack of cancels and awkward specials and supers, these are actually the closest thing Gill has to light confirms. They're nothing crazy, but at least they're safe and better than nothing. Standing Light Punch also links into Crouching Heavy Punch. This sounds incredible, but it's actually nothing that crazy. It's a 1 frame link, and you need to be point blank, so I don't think it would actually be very useful. Stand Medium Punch was one of Urien's best buttons, and admittedly, it might be better on Urien than it is on Gill. Gill's Stand Medium Punch is a frame faster. The startup went from frame 5 to 4, and the recovery went from 20 to 19. However, not being able to cancel this move is a real bummer. Urien, even outside of Aegis stuff, could use it in combos, it made it a better anti-air. I don't know. It's a great poke on Gill, but unlike Urien, that's all it is. Crouching medium punch, on the other hand, was giga buffed. It starts up nearly twice as fast, recovers a whole 10 frames faster, now has a second hitbox that actually is disjointed on the first active frame, and does over 4 times as much stun as Urien's. Like stand medium punch, it's mostly just a poke, and maybe an anti-air if you're brave enough. But nonetheless, it's a fantastic one. Much better than the very situational move it was on Urien. Standing medium kick is still just a poke, but now it's a better one. The recovery is the same as Urien's, but the startup has gone from frame 8 to frame 6, it now has a bigger, disjointed hitbox, and there's no longer an extended hurtbox on the leg the frame before the hitbox appears. Gill's crouching medium kick is a very interesting button. It's actually got a slightly smaller hitbox than Urien's, although to compensate, the hurtbox on the leg is significantly smaller and it's no longer present the frame before the hitbox appears. However, the startup is ludicrous. It's gone from frame 7 to frame 2. This ties it for the fastest button in the game, and it has massive reach for a button this fast, even with a nerfed hitbox. You can net a lot of punishes that were previously reserved for specific supers. Forward medium kick is a bit of a weird one. It is a significantly better poke with better frame data and hitbox and hurtbox improvements, but I don't really think it stands up well compared to Gill's other pokes. Pretty much all of the utility of this move on Urien came from its use in unblockable setups, and Gill has none of that. It's a fine poke, but I don't really see what the point of it is compared to things like stand medium kick or crouching medium punch. I'm talking about Gill's jump normals just before his heavy buttons because the heavy jump normals are the only ones that are really worth touching on. There's nothing to say about his light and medium ones. Nearly the same as Urien's, just with better frame data, damage, and stun. Gill's heavy jump normals are very cool, because unlike most jump normals, they send the opponent into a juggle state on air connect rather than an air reset, which is just very fun. They do increment the juggle counter by 3, so you can only get so much after, but still, this leaves them as arguably the most rewarding air-to-airs in the game. I'm a big fan of this, it's very fun. That's not the only improvement these moves received either. On top of the usual damage and stun increases, they also hit 1 frame earlier, and their hitboxes are improved. Jumping heavy punch has a massive disjoint on the first active frame, and jumping heavy kick has a smaller hurtbox on the leg compared to Urien, which, if you know anything about Urien's jumping heavy kick, is a fucking heinous change to make. As you might have guessed from seeing it used in juggles, standing heavy punch is excellent. It pops the opponent up on air connect, unlike Urien's, which slams them down. Gill's is a combo extender, Urien's is a combo ender. However, there is one area where this move actually got a tiny bit weaker compared to Urien. Gill's standing heavy punch is one of his only 2 normals to have more recovery on Gill than it does on Urien, going from 29 frames to 31, so it's now -5 on block instead of -3. However, it's not objectively worse as a poke. Urien's standing heavy punch had a hitbox close to his body that is now gone for Gill, but to compensate, Gill's has a new hitbox that hits much further out, and he extends his hurtbox less. Standing heavy kicks changes are actually remarkably similar to standing heavy punches. Its startup has been decreased by 1 frame, going from frame 17 to frame 16, and it's still an overhead. However, like standing heavy punch, the recovery of this move was increased by 2 frames, going from 43 frames to 45. This is actually kind of an issue because this move was already not amazing on hit and block, going from -3, -5, and -7 on crouching hit, standing hit, and block, to -6, -8, and -10. As you might have guessed, this move is also very disjointed, with a smaller hurtbox and a bigger hitbox. The second active frame in particular looks absolutely fucking vile, even by Gill standards. Like Urien, this move can hit twice against an airborne opponent, but unlike Urien, it gives a juggle state instead of slamming them down. Unfortunately, it's not a very workable juggle since it sends the opponent very far and the move itself has very high recovery. Mid-screen, your best bet is probably a juggle to meteor strike on the player 2 side. Crouching heavy kick is incredible with some of the absolute best improvements to frame data. The startup has been cut by over half, going from 15 frames to only 7, and the recovery has gone from 45 frames to only 24. On top of the usual damage and stun buffs, this move no longer extends Gill's hurtbox the frame before the hitbox appears, and speaking of the hitbox, it's much bigger while the hurtbox is smaller, making this move very disjointed. Maybe the coolest aspect of crouching heavy kick is the fact that you can juggle out of it. I mentioned earlier that mid-screen, a point-blank crouching heavy kick into standing medium kick is a near-universal combo. In the corner, you have a fully universal one into standing medium punch. The damage isn't that crazy, but you can get a reset into Meteor Strike. However, while it does vary a lot depending on the opponent's character and the side of the screen you're on, you can juggle a crouching heavy punch after a crouching heavy kick, and that's where you get the good stuff. Crouching heavy kick into crouching heavy punch works on both sides of the screen against 5 characters, those being 12, Q, Makoto, Hugo, and Elena. Although, against Elena, I've only managed to get 1 hit of crouching heavy punch on the player 1 side, and I've only done it exactly once. It might have been like a frame 1 micro walk thing. Finally, we have crouching heavy punch, which is arguably the single best button in the entire game. That's mainly due to what it enables for Gill, but even in a vacuum, this button is incredible. Compared to Urian's, the startup has been decreased from 9 frames to 5, and the recovery has been reduced from 36 frames to 27. It's also now very disjointed, so it's a much more consistent anti-air. Unlike Urian's, which is minus 10 on block and leaves the opponent relatively close, Gill's crouching heavy punch is often safe. Against most crouching characters, it's only minus 6, and the pushback is much more significant. Most characters need a specific super to get a punish here, and a lot of them can't punish it at all. Unlike Urian, the second hit of Gill's crouching heavy punch whiffs on nearly every crouching character, although this is actually kind of a shame because, again, unlike Urian, it's actually better on block if the opponent blocks both hits than just the one. It makes it minus 3 instead of minus 6, while for Urian this makes it minus 10 instead of minus 9. Hugo is the only character in the game who has to block both hits if he's crouching. This only matters on block because the first hit forces stand. And lastly, but still very importantly, the second hit of Gill's crouching heavy punch only increments the juggle counter by 1, unlike Urian's which increments it by 2. The first hit will also increment the juggle counter by 1, but only if it hits an airborne opponent. Against a grounded opponent, it won't increment it at all. However, now that we're finally done with the little details of crouching heavy punch, it's finally time to get into the nitty gritty of what it actually enables for Gill, and the crux of what makes him so absurdly broken: his touch of death combos. If Gill lands a crouching heavy punch in the corner, then out of the game's 20 characters, all 20 are dead, regardless of their current health or stun, and the combo Gill does this with is nearly universal: chop, tackle, chop, tackle, chop or tackle for the stun, and 3 2-hit tackles for the kill. Against Hugo, the standard route is fine on the player 2 side, but not so much on the player 1 side, where it's very easy to get 2-hit tackles when you don't want them. Instead, I'd recommend chop, chop, tackle, chop, chop. Q is the only character where you need an alternate route, because juggling into just the second hit of tackle against him in the corner is practically impossible. Against him, you just want to do chop 4 times into either a 5th or a tackle. I'd also recommend this against the laner on the player 2 side, where the standard route is extremely difficult. Speaking of Q, you might be wondering what the story is with characters who can increase their effective health by taunting. If Q sets up one taunt, it's business as usual, but if he sets up two, you need a jump in and a post-stun taunt, which I'm almost certain is not guaranteed. However, if he sets up 3 taunts, even with a post-stun taunt, a pre-stun taunt, and a crouching opponent, he clings to life by a fucking pixel. 4 taunts Hugo is in the same boat as 2 taunts Q. You need a heavy jump in and a post-stun taunt. Even if Chung gets the lucky backstretch taunt, which increases her effective health by over 30%, all you need is a crouching heavy punch. It pains me to say this, but unless I've missed something, and I really fucking hope I have, Q is the only character in the game to be well and truly spared from a corner TOD from Gill. You hate to see it. If you land a crouching heavy punch somewhere around mid-screen, then out of the game's 20 characters, 14 of them are dead regardless of health or stun, and the route is the same for all of them. Tackle, tackle, chop, tackle. The 6 characters with a longer stun bar than the rest of the cast are spared a touch of death off crouching heavy punch, instead only having their stun increased by a mere 90%. If you want a true touch of death on these characters, you'll need a jump in first. When Gill himself is cornered, things get pretty interesting. Out of the game's 20 characters, 12 are dead off a single crouching heavy punch. The combo for all of them is the same. 1 2-hit tackle into 3 where you only get the second hit. Twelve and Urian join the cast of characters who require a jump in before the crouching heavy punch, since getting a second 2-hit tackle on them is inevitable. However, this is only the case on the player 1 side. On the player 2 side, you still kill 14 out of 20 characters. It's only 12 out of 20 on the player 1 side. Oro, Dudley, and Alex all require the jump in, although for Alex you do have the option of starting with raw tackle, because he's just like that. Once again, Q is taking a stand against Gill as the only character in the entire game who, at least in this position, is safe from a meterless touch of death. Against him, you'll need not just a jump in, but Meteor Strike. Gill and Hugo are halfway there. On the player 1 side, it's the same as Q, a heavy jump in and Meteor Strike, but on the player 2 side, just the heavy jump in will do. Now, one thing I do want to point out is that, like I said earlier, there isn't really any Gill documentation out there, so everything I just told you regarding Gill's Touch of Death combos is from my own testing over the last couple of weeks. It's entirely possible I've missed something, so what I've done is I've included this little spreadsheet in the description that just kind of details who dies to what. If you can optimize any of this, just let me know, send me a video of it on Twitter or YouTube, and I'll update the spreadsheet and leave a pinned comment saying what's been updated. There's also some other stuff in here regarding what you can get after a sweep, and how tackle interacts with standing and crouching characters, because, I don't know, I thought it would look nice if there was more stuff in there. So finally, after all of that, that's pretty much everything I have to say about Gill's kit. He's obviously ludicrously strong, but in a weird way he's kind of a limited character. Like, he's got a lot of basic pokes that don't lead to much. His specials don't even work half the time, and his supers, while good, are very, very unorthodox, so he misses out on a lot of third strikey things like traditional confirms or punishes. There are plenty of characters who do certain things better than Gill. He has lows and he has overheads, but they're not as consistently rewarding as someone like Ken or Dudley's. He has some incredible pokes, but again, his neutral isn't as consistently rewarding as someone like Chun's, who can stock multiple supers and, you know, confirm into them on either side of the screen. He doesn't have Akuma's versatility, he doesn't have Makoto's pressure, he doesn't even have a reversal outside of whatever the fuck headbutt is. But none of it matters, because he's Gill. He just plays third strike better than every other character in the game by a massive fucking margin. He pushes his big fuck off buttons that you are almost certainly not punishing, and he is doing more damage and stun with them than yours could ever dream of. And if you dare to push one of your own, try to take your turn back against this monster, there's a good chance he'll parry it, and then he'll punish you. A very common scenario in Third Strike. When other characters get that opportunity, they go for a punish, get some damage, get a knockdown, and maybe that knockdown is an opportune time for them to put some of their unique tools to use, like an overhead low 50-50 where both sides lead to super, or the threat of a command grab, something to keep the momentum going. When Gill gets a knockdown after a punish, he does his win pose, and the next round starts, because there's like a 90% chance the punish killed you. Gill does not need momentum, he does not need opportunities. He wants an opportunity, and he can get it off one of the best moves in the game, that characters can't even punish half the time without spending a resource, and plenty can't punish at all. He is on a completely different level. So that's everything I have to say about Gill in Third Strike. I'm sorry if this felt like it went on way longer than it needed to, but like I said, there's not really Gill documentation out there, so I really wanted to talk about everything I could find with this character. I just love talking about stupid non-playable characters, and if I don't tell you stuff now, I don't know, maybe you'll never find out about it, and I don't want that. If I don't tell you that this character you can't play as has a terrible move that hits two characters while they're crouching, and is plus 12 on hit against one and minus 17 against the other, you might never find that out. And I can't have that. So, yeah. Thanks so much for watching, I hope you learned something. Have a good one.